Hello everyone, I know we're short for time so I'll keep it blunt. My name is Ian Thomas, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University College Dublin in Ireland. I am part of the Agri-Benchmark project, which is a project looking at benchmarking sustainable nutrient management on Irish farms. We're funded by the Environmental Protection Agency of Ireland, and we have affiliations from University College Cork, Chagas, ICEI, and so essentially we're benchmarking nationally representative nitrogen and phosphorus farm gate balances and use efficiencies of Irish farms to encourage sustainable management. So just to put it into context, this project, Ireland is currently experiencing agricultural intensification, particularly in the dairy sector following abolition of EU quotas, milk quotas in 2015. So there's a challenge of achieving sustainable intensification whilst minimising nitrogen and phosphorus losses and meeting EU Nitrates Directive water quality obligations. Reducing nutrient surpluses and inefficiencies are critical in terms of reducing diffuse pollution, so things like eutrophication, drinking water pollution, impacts on ecosystem services, and also improving farm profitability. So it's a win-win situation if you reduce your inefficiencies and surpluses. And so government policymakers and farmers are increasingly interested in key performance indicators of farm nutrient management. So it's setting benchmarks, it's like identifying benchmarks and setting them in order to set targets and motivate improvements in the sector. So our project looks at establishing nationally representative benchmarks. Also, if Ireland breaches its Water Framework Directive water quality targets as a result of the agricultural intensification we're experiencing, then it could lose its derogation status to stock livestock above the threshold of 170 kilograms of organic nitrogen per hectare, which would severely hinder national policy aims. And this kind of scenario has already happened in the Netherlands this year, where they're forced to cull a significant proportion of, well, 5% I think, of its national dairy herd. So it's a real risk. So in terms of key performance indicators of nutrient management on Irish farms, we're looking at nutrient counting, specifically the nutrient balance in kilograms per hectare, so that's imports of nitrogen or phosphorus minus the through the farm gate, minus the imports in terms of concentrate feeds, fertiliser, forage feeds and livestock inputs, and then exports such as milk, crops, wool and livestock. And then the other key performance indicator we look at is nutrient use efficiency. So that's a percentage, and that's exports divided by imports. So the nutrient counting data that I'm using in our project is from the Chagas National Farm Survey. It's part of the EU Farm Accountancy Data Network, but it accounts for more data so that we can account for these nutrient balances. So we're using 1,479 nationally representative farms, statistically representative of the different sectors in Ireland, and using the annual import and export data collected from 2008 to 2015. Our farm categories are based on sector, production intensity and soil drainage class. So for sector it's dairy, mixed livestock, which is a mixture of livestock such as dairy, sheep or beef cattle, and maybe a tillage component within that. And then suckler cattle, non-suckler cattle, these are beef systems, sheep and tillage sectors. Production intensity, that's essentially the total NLP exports in kilograms per hectare, and the soil drainage class. So I'll just go briefly into like temporal variations and results to begin with, and then look at the actual benchmarking that we undertook. So on the bottom here is the different sectors. This is for end balance. This is from 2008 on the left to 2015 on the right for each sector, annual data. And as you can see, dairy has the highest end balances, whilst sheep has the lowest. Dairy and mixed livestock. Mixed livestock typically includes some dairy component. So as you can see, dairy has the highest balances of all the sectors. Also, what you see is a high peak in 2013 of the balances for the livestock types. Now, this was due to a fodder crisis in 2013 in Ireland, where poor weather in winter of 2012 and spring of 2013 caused increases in imports of forage and concentrates, which resulted in these higher surpluses. And when you look at the nutrient use efficiency, so as a percentage, that's exports divided by imports, 100% obviously is the, well, essentially the target, although it's impossible. Anything above 100% indicates soil nutrient mining of reserves. As you can see, dairy has typically the lowest nutrient use efficiencies, whilst tillage has by far the highest, well, I think it was 20%, 40% roughly higher than dairy. And sheep also typically has quite high nutrient use efficiencies compared to the other sectors. Then we break it down into the imports and the exports very briefly. So as you can see, dairy typically has higher imports compared to other sectors, and exports. Dairy, for example, is consistently increasing, particularly up to 2015. So from 2014 to 2015, in advance of the milk quota abolishment, the dairy sector started to intensify, bring in more livestock, and you can see that in the total exports up to 2015 here. And in regards to tillage, the exports are much higher. So P balance, we'll just go into that briefly. So anything below a P balance of 0 means that the farm is in deficiency, and it's mining soil nutrient, soil P reserves. So as you can see, the P balance is a lot lower to this target of 0 that we're hoping for. And for tillage especially, approximately 20% of the data points were actually deficient in P. So whilst in the 1990s in Ireland there was excessive soil P levels, now in soil test P results we're starting to see deficiencies. So this is a bit of a concern. And again, dairy tends to have higher P balances. And for P use efficiencies, the actual use efficiencies for P is a lot higher relative to N. So all sectors performed relatively well, particularly tillage. And again, as for P import, when you break it down into imports and exports, I don't really have time to go into this now, but you can see the presentation at the end. Now, just to plot the N or P balance in relation to the N or P use efficiency, you can't assume that for a given N balance, for example, you'll have the same use efficiency. There's a wide variety here, so use efficiency on the y-axis for a given N balance. This is for all sectors and all years. There's a wide variety in use efficiencies, and that's down to farm management decisions, technical scale management efficiencies that vary between farms and locations, and soil types, things like that. So when you break it down into sector, here are the plots. Dairy, for example, typically has the highest nutrient end balances and performs relatively poorly in terms of use efficiencies compared to tillage, which has a different relationship, it's more linear. The livestock relationships tend to kind of curve up to the 0 balance and 100% use efficiency point. Anything in this sector here, featured in the graphs, indicates soil nutrient mining of reserves. And for P balance, again, this is for all sectors in all years, P balance versus use efficiency. and we break it down into sectors. So as you can see, it kind of illustrates that a lot of the farms and years are actually in P deficiencies. So just briefly summary statistics of those before I go to the benchmarking. So dairy performs worse for the balances for both N and P, but in terms of use efficiencies, it's actually not the worst performing in red, it's actually second or third worst. So mixed livestock and suckler beef cattle actually have worse use efficiencies for nutrients. And tillage and sheep both perform very well in terms of balances and use efficiencies, particularly tillage. So now into the benchmarking. So essentially we want to produce nationally representative benchmarks to set targets and motivate improvements in nutrient management on Irish farms. So in order to do this, we want to find out which farms have the lowest nutrient balances, the highest use efficiencies, and the highest gross margins in euro per hectare. To do this, we use quantile regression analysis, which essentially splits the data into percentiles. If you have a look at a relationship between two variables, it can still create percentile groups. We do this in R, and we do this on the relationship between the production intensity and the N or P balance. So the production intensity in terms of the total N or P exports. So ignore the colour scheme for now, but essentially we split it up into sectors, so dairy, mixed livestock, sheep, suckler cow, non-suckler, and tillage. And essentially these regression lines split the data up into percentiles. So from Q10, Q25, Q50, Q75, and Q90. So any point below this Q90 line is the top 10% of farms in this relationship between the total N exports and the N balance. So these farms, for a given production intensity, say 40 kilograms per hectare, these farms here have lower N balances compared to the farms on this Q10, above this Q10 line, the worst 10% performing farms. And just right off the bat, you can see there's a large spread of variation for a given production intensity. So you can already see there's significant nutrient management improvements that farms can make. And so essentially these benchmark farms, we set these as benchmark farms. However, we also want to consider the nutrient use efficiency and the gross margin. So what we do is we colour code the points. So in blue here are the best 10% for use efficiency, and in red the worst 10%. So for example, if you're in this location here with the dark green, you're within the Q75 line, so you're top 25% in regards to N balance, but you're, sorry if you're here, but in the light green, because you're a light green point, you're actually top 50% in terms of use efficiency. So the relationship in use efficiency is actually slightly different here. So now we want to basically then select the benchmark farms which are blue and below the regression line. So as you can see, tillage, for example, has a much different relationship compared to the livestock farms. When we colour code the points according to gross margin as well, so the blue points are the best performing farms in terms of gross margin, we see that essentially the higher production intensity farms with the greater total export tend to have higher gross margins, as we expect. So we want to then integrate those, so we take the top percentiles for both use efficiency and gross margins to create an integrated colour scheme essentially. So then this is the optimal benchmark zone here. So if we want to, so the benchmarks are essentially set at, for example, below the Q75 line, so the top 25% of farms with the lowest N balances. But then also, if you want to consider those that have the highest use efficiencies and gross margins, it'll be these blue points below the Q7 line here. So that's for N. For P, we do the same. So again, we do regression regression analysis. We colour code for nutrient use, phosphorus use efficiency, and for gross margins. It's the same kind of results you see. And then we integrate colour schemes. So now we get an integrated benchmark zone for P as well. Now you'll notice that due to the quantile regressions, because it considers those farms that are deficient, it's actually it's setting a benchmark zone that's in deficiency here. So I'll go into that in a minute of how I correct that, but just to illustrate how we do this benchmark. So in terms of policy implications, aiming for a 0 kilogram per hectare balance is not achievable for intensive farms and certain sectors. Aiming for low surpluses is rather needed to offset unaccounted environmental losses. So the nutrient balances that we calculate do not consider environmental losses. They're only the imports and exports that are directly under the farmer's control, which is what we want in terms of nutrient management performance. But you essentially need a surplus to account for these unaccounted environmental losses. So then in terms of policy, what is the minimum surplus achievable for a given sector and production intensity, i.e. the benchmark target? And can we identify maximum permissible surpluses that could be set by policy to prevent unsustainable nutrient surpluses and excessive environmental source pressures? Yes, we can. So essentially, if I take dairy, once we identify this optimal benchmark zone, so for example, the top 25% of the farms with the lowest end balances and they have the highest use efficiencies and highest gross margins, that would be your optimal benchmark zone. But in terms of your maximum permitted end balance surplus, you want to improve the performance of the low performing farms. So if all these data points above the Q10 regression line, so the poorest 10%, the 10% of farmers that are worst performers, you could set a policy target so that all these farms have to reduce their end balance surpluses to below this line. So they could do this either by just reducing their balances, so for example reducing imports of fertiliser, or they can increase their exports whilst keeping the balances the same, or they can do both. And then you can do, for these regression lines, they're essentially like farm-specific benchmark zones. So if a farm is in this zone here, he can aim for the next regression line down, because it may not be reasonable for him to aim for this optimal benchmark zone. So how do we account for a lot of farms where they're actually unsustainable? So some benchmark farms may actually be unsustainable and in deficiencies long term, because they have balance deficits and use efficiencies that are greater than 100%, indicating that they're using soil nutrient reserves. So in the short term, some of these benchmark farms may legitimately need deficits to reduce, for example, excessive soil test P concentrations. How do we know which benchmark farms are actually unsustainable long term and which are genuine best practice farms that are only in deficit short term? We don't have those soil test P results for these nationally representative data. So essentially what I do is I remove any farms that are below an M balance of -10 and a P balance of -5. I remove any farms below that level because from the nationally representative results, that's what seems to be kind of unreasonable. Then I take the absolute value of those farms that are within the 0 to -5 P balance or 0 to -10 N balance, because essentially those farms are performing just as well as the farms from 0 to +5 P balance or 0 to +10 N balance. And then when you do the quantile regression, rerun the analysis, it's a more reasonable result and accounts for those farms that are actually sustainable, but just within a little bit of a deficit. So in conclusion, NMP balances, sheep were lowest, and dairy highest, and for use efficiencies, tillage were highest, suckler cattle lowest. You could see impacts from the fodder crisis and the dairy milk quota abolishment in 2015. I showed how we do our benchmarking approach. And in terms of agricultural intensification, from our results, we will see that if you increase your production intensity, you will increase your surpluses, but you will also increase your use efficiency, so your resource use efficiency, and your gross margin. And the benchmark farms that we identify are essentially those which reduce their surpluses to relatively low levels. So they're actually quite sustainable. And yeah, so in terms of policy as well, it's not appropriate to set flat rate maximum permissible surpluses, because that doesn't consider the production intensity. So essentially the maximum permissible surplus standards should be controlled by the production intensity. Future work, you can see that in the presentation and online afterwards, I don't have time to get into that. And here are my contact details. You can find me on Twitter as well, @AgriBenchmark. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes, please.
Please explain how far efficiency can exceed 100%.
So some farms would have like 1,000%, or some extreme farms would have 1,000% or 3,000%. It's just essentially what it means is they're using soil nutrient reserves that aren't accounted for in the balance. So essentially they're mining soil nutrient reserves. And so frankly, even aiming for 100% use efficiency is impossible. There's inevitable efficiencies. So I would expect any farm that's reaching 90% efficiency is really kind of approaching the absolute maximum efficiency they can. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, please.
When you calculate these budgets and efficiencies, are you also taking into account nitrogen fixing crops and so on?
Did you repeat the question, sorry?
If you are taking into account nitrogen fixing crops, I mean.
Right, yeah. So that essentially, at the moment, we've just done balances and use efficiencies for those factors that the farmers control. We don't have the data for fixation, immobilization, environmental losses, things like that. But we are now we're trying to attempt to create another balance analysis which accounts for things like that, using kind of more national data that's possibly available. We're looking into that, essentially.
I have a question about these farms that are nutrient mining. So what do you see is the best policy incentive to get them using more nutrients or more sustainable systems to stop the nutrient mining?
Good question. So I mean, there's like the EU Nitrates Directive regulations in Ireland is set so that you aim for, we use this national soil test, the test in Ireland is called Morgan's P, and so best practice is to aim for example, 5 to 8 milligrams per litre of Morgan's P for the tillage and for grassland. And so, I mean, there are regulations that are trying to aim for agronomically optimum soil test P levels. But our work is kind of looking at reducing surpluses to a level that's within agronomic optimum. So part of the work that we will be doing is setting balances and use efficiencies that targets that are within agronomic optimums. So we're trying to look at the relationship between these balances and the soil test P, for example.
So this could be some special subsidy later? Or?
That's a policy question. I couldn't possibly tell.
Okay, thank you very much.
Right, thank you.